This Out and About with Jamie Grout podcast is all about Grinnell history, and we're going to be talking to a guy by the name of Dan Kaiser. And if you've heard my interviews in the past with Larry Hurto, you know that for Newton and Jasper County, Larry has been quite a historian, and I refer to Dan as Grinnell's version of Larry Hurto because he's written a book about little-known people in Grinnell who should be focused on, and he wanted to put the spotlight on these folks because they deserved it, and they're part of Grinnell history, and we'll get to that in just a couple of moments. First of all, we want to thank our sponsors, Grinnell State Bank, with offices not only in Grinnell, but in Johnston, Marengo, and Polk City. And if you want to get started with online and mobile banking, all you have to do is go to their website. You can get started and open your accounts in just 15 minutes. If you're not sure what you need, simply check Simply Banking and open your accounts online or in person or at any of their 4 locations. They have financial advisors that can help you out, loan officers and insurance agents working under the same roof. You can get signed up for MasterCard debit cards, and there are no monthly fees on those debit cards either. And if you want to do live chat with somebody, a real person, you can do that online also with Grinnell State Bank. Also want to thank the gang at Total Choice Shipping and Printing in Grinnell. A couple days ago, they started with the Valentine's pre-order, and if you're like them, you might often forget this holiday is upon us, and sometimes they get the class list only to find out that you find yourself left with zero time to prepare. Well, they are posting all the various Valentine styles they have in stock and are ready to go home with you to be having those Valentines customized. Post on the photo how many you'd like, and they will pull those and have them ready for you to pick up in the store, or email them what you would like them to do. And the email address is sales@totalchoicegrinnell.com. Sales@totalchoicegrinnell.com. It's another Out and About with Jamie Grout podcast, and I am looking forward to talking to this gentleman. It's Dan Kaiser. And if you've heard my interviews in the past with Larry Hurto, I introduced myself to him and told him he was Grinnell's version of Larry Hurto. He's quite a historian, and he's written a book that you should know about called Grinnell Stories, Lives to Remember. And these are about, I guess, Dan, people who most folks in Grinnell that made some important history that they don't know about.
Yeah, the object here was to try to talk about the town, but not naming all the people that you would think to name. Everybody knows about J.B. Grinnell and other folk who have been here and been important. I was trying to excavate some of those lives that were kind of important in their time, but people lost track of, and we don't remember them anymore. So these are 11 examples drawn out over about 100 years or so of Grinnell's history, 5 women and 6 men, who, in my opinion, made important contributions, but are now forgotten.
Well, let's go down the list of those 5 and find out who they are, Dan.
Well, let's see if I can remember them all here. I better cheat a little bit to get the list here. One of the people that I wanted to talk about here that I think a lot of people didn't even know about is a man who was actually born in Mississippi, born in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and was born as a slave, and came here really because when Union armies liberated Vicksburg in 1864, he went with the Army men, several of whom were from Chester Township, just north of Grinnell here, and he ended up coming back to Grinnell and ended up working out in Chester Township in the late 1860s. He had to have been the only black man out there, and he'd come from Mississippi a long ways away. How he ended up here was kind of an unusual story. But then he got the bug for education, moved into town, spent 2 years attending the college preparatory school, the academy they called it at one time, as kind of getting ready for college, and then went back to Mississippi and became quite an important person. During Reconstruction, was Justice of the Peace and served as a local NGO official down there. Amazing man, George Washington Stith. As I say, one of the black people in town that we don't know very much about. The last person in the story, the 11th person, is also a black man, but a very different circumstance. Dennis DeCateau was born in New York, but he was born to immigrant parents. Both his parents were from Grenada, and his parents were musical. He was a twin. He and his brother, his twin brother, were both trained in music in New York, very able persons. He wanted to become a conductor. And he said that at that time, it's still true, I think, being a black man, to be a conductor is extremely hard to do. He was able to manage it, got his degree from NYU, taught it in a bunch of places and so on. And in 1964 was picked the first black person to appear on the Grinnell College faculty. So 1960s, you remember, was not an easy time in America to be black, and it wasn't easy here in Grinnell either. He ran into some tough circumstances. But he left in 1968. He had a couple kids by that time, went on to become a very successful conductor of the San Francisco ballet orchestra. Ballet orchestra. They now have a chair named after him out there and so on. So he was clearly an excellent musician, but that's what students here knew already in the 60s. But he, interesting person, very few people know about today. Well, another person I want to talk about here is someone who a lot of people might think was unimportant. We're sitting now doing this recording on 4th Avenue in Grinnell. And in 1954, in the spring of 1954, elderly gentleman, he was in his 90s already, was out on 4th Avenue here. He only had on a jacket, didn't have any pants or anything else on, and the police picked him up. He was looking for a pharmacy that had disappeared 20 years ago. He was living above one of the stores down here on 4th Avenue. They took him to Montezuma. He ended up in the home down in Mount Pleasant because he was delirious, I guess we would say, or suffering from some sort of dementia. Anyway, he died not long after that, and it got a long process going, which involved clearing out his apartment right down the way here, and they took away truckloads of trash. But the thing that was important about James Totten, his name was that stuck in among all this trash was a lot of cash. They found over $70,000 stuffed, this is 1954, $70,000, stuffed into secret drawers and bags and all the rest of it. Totten was a man that a lot of people thought was eccentric. He used to walk along the railroad tracks to pick up spare coal. He was not connected to the electricity. He used a lamp instead. People would not visit with him on the street. You wanted to hire him to paint. He was a painter and wallpaper. You had to put a note under his door. A strange person whom very few people knew, but he was living a kind of private life with all this wealth that disappeared. His relatives had no idea he had the money. He wouldn't write to them. One time, one of his sisters, I think it was, came to town. He wouldn't see her. An unusual person, but yet he's a person who was living right here in the midst of us. And it reminds me that when we think about Grinnell, which is what I'm writing about here, there are lots of people that we don't know about what's going on in their lives. And James Totten is one of those persons whom we would certainly have ignored, but who was living a most fascinating and interesting, but very private life. There's another person who was another woman, actually, who was an interesting and difficult case in Grinnell. She came to Grinnell in 1878 and said she was a gynecologist. Turns out her medical degrees and so on were manufactured. At least I couldn't find any evidence of them anywhere. But what brought her to public attention was that in 1898, she was charged with having caused an abortion in a woman here in town. Abortion in 19th century Iowa was not the same deal that we're thinking about today. It's estimated that 1 in 5 conceptions in Iowa at that time ended in what today we would call abortion. But even so, this case is probably a kind of wacky one. Not very many women were prosecuted for anything in 19th century Iowa, and certainly not for abortion. She was arrested and sent to Anamosa, where she spent several years. The punishment was 5 years and $5,000, I think it was, fine. She never lived to escape out of Anamosa. But what we found out later was that she had developed an interest in working class politics and so on. Some of your listeners may remember that in Chicago in the 1870s, there was 1880s, excuse me, was a kind of disastrous experience, something called the Haymarket Affair. There was a march in behalf of workers in the 8-hour day. Somebody threw some bombs into it, killed some policemen and several. She was totally appalled by what had happened, not so much by the bombing as by the fact that the ringleaders, or at least the people who were accused, were arrested and were eventually executed, in fact, in public in Chicago, were hanged. And she had become kind of a patron of them. And according to some letters that she wrote, she had organized a kind of working class reading group to talk about politics of the labor and so on. And I think that in the end, that's the kind of thing which got her into trouble. Mary Herma Akins was her name, or Akins, it sometimes had the S on it and so on. She had joined the Congregational Church when she came to town, just like all respectable white folk did at the time, but she ditched it later on and painted herself as a kind of radical. And I think the people in town, none of whom remarked on her death, there was no obituary in the newspaper, no complaints, even when the state Supreme Court reversed her conviction and so on. She'd gotten herself on the wrong side of the law, and it ended up being kind of isolated and left alone.
They kind of disowned her then.
They did, and she was not part of, well, in fact, J.B. Grinnell's cousin, I think it was one of the prosecutors in the Haymarket affair and so on. That just made Akins even more irate than she was otherwise. But she was definitely on the wrong side of official Grinnell at that time. Some of the other people that I was talking about are maybe more conventional. Some folk will have heard of Cornelia Shepard Clark, who herself was born here in town, went to local schools, went to Grinnell College, graduated from Grinnell College and so on. But what they probably would not have remembered about her, she died in the early 1930s from cancer, died way too young. She was in her 50s at the time, but she was a remarkable photographer and published hundreds and hundreds of photographs in official magazines and journals and so on. She was lionized when she was still quite young because she used to dress up her cats as people, a little bit like Beatrix Potter did, with her drawings about the bunnies and all the rest of it and so on. And she made little furniture to go with them, so they told stories. And Peter and Polly was a story that she had published in 1912, got a really favorable reception. But the photographer that she became was really kind of a professional photographer, very accomplished woman who left behind thousands of, she was operating, mind you, this is the 1920s and 1930s, what it meant to take a picture in those days. These huge cameras and the glass plate negatives and all the rest of it. Very accomplished photographer. She died early and left behind about 3,000 photographic plates in the possession of a Grinnell College professor, Henry Conard, who took them with him when he went to teach at the University of Iowa and then sort of ignored them. We luckily stumbled upon about 1,000 of them a few years ago and got them cataloged and preserved to the extent that we could. Some were already quite damaged, but several thousand are totally missing, and we'll never know any more about them unless there's some accident somewhere they were saved. But it's people like that I want to draw attention to, that the official narratives concentrate, I think, too much upon people who are in the news every day, and we forget about other people just as accomplished in their own ways, but who sort of drift out of our attention.
I have to ask you, because you've written this book about some very interesting people around Grinnell, and again, we're talking with Dan Kaiser, and his book is Grinnell Stories, Lives to Remember, and I have to ask you, what is it that makes you most proud of being in Grinnell in Poweshiek County?
When I came here, I came to Grinnell in 1979 to teach Russian history, and that's what I had done professionally. I'd spent time in Soviet Union as it was then, and most vacations I left town in order to go to the Soviet Union if I could, or go somewhere else where there was a big library that I could benefit from. And I didn't think much about Grinnell. We had kids in the schools here, we were on the PTA and so on, but I didn't think about the town. When I retired, I thought I should change that. And I tried to get myself thinking more about the locality. I tried to think about the kind of history that I had enjoyed doing about Russia, and that was about people that weren't so much in the center. You might guess from what I said before that I was interested in the more everyday kind of life and everyday people and what they were thinking, why they were thinking about that. And I found a lot of rich materials here which corresponded to a time when increasing quantities of material were digitized. So I could sit in my apartment. I'm now retired. I live in the Mayflower down the street here. I can sit in my living room with my laptop open to, access the world. So I could get access to tons of newspapers and so on from previous ages that made it really interesting and relatively easy in order to excavate the past. So what makes me proud about this when I think about the town, we're sitting in one of the buildings that anchors the historic context.
The Jewel Box building.
That's right, Lewis Sullivan's Jewel Box Bank. We have a history here, and we can celebrate it, and we should celebrate it. Not just by people like Louis Sullivan, but by the people who lived here and made this town out of nothing really on the prairie.
That is pretty neat. Now, where is your book available?
The Pioneer Bookstore has it for sale during the during the working hours during the week. The museum also, the book is entirely for the museum. I don't get anything out of it. More people buy it. They're helping the museum, which is, as you know, is in the business of refurbishing a whole new building. They're trying to outfit it properly. So it's also for sale from the museum, but the museum hours are limited while they're going through this reconstruction now.
All right, fantastic. Well, this is neat. The book is called Grinnell Stories, Lives to Remember, and you've got a whole bunch of people in here, and it looks like you have some pictures too, huh?
Yeah, there are a lot of photographs. Again, most of these I grabbed out of stuff that's available on the web and so on. But yep, there's some good pictures as well as good stories, I think.
If people have questions or want to contact you, Dan, how can they do that?
The best way probably is through the museum. If you know, the museum has a website, Grinnell Historical Museum.com. You can also reach me just for the last name, Kaiser, Kaiser, at grinnell.edu.
Thanks for writing this book. I'm sure people are going to find it very fascinating. Check it out. Grinnell Stories, Lives to Remember, written by Dan Kaiser, our interview guest on Out and About with Jamie Grau. Until next time, out is out. See ya.